How does firing someone over a $200 expense turn into losing a $4 million contract? At 9:06 a.m. on a Wednesday, my CEO called to say the client had walked. Then he asked the question he should have asked before firing me. What did you tell them? The answer was nothing. I did not sabotage a deal. I did not contact the client. I did not even mention the company after they fired me. But I had spent 6 years building the trust behind that contract, and their arrogance destroyed it in less than 10 days. Every story here is about someone who got underestimated and made them regret it. My name is Margaret Hale, and I worked for a commercial construction company called Westbridge Build Group. Westbridge built office parks, medical clinics, distribution centers, and mid-sized industrial facilities throughout the Midwest. It was not a famous company. It was not flashy, but it had a good reputation. When a developer needed a project finished on time, within budget, and without constant surprises, Westbridge was usually on the short list. That reputation was built by project managers like me. I started there as an assistant project coordinator when I was 26. I learned how to read plans, track subcontractors, fight for materials, manage inspections, and explain bad news before it became expensive news. Construction has a simple rule. A small problem ignored early becomes a large problem with a dollar sign attached. A delayed permit becomes a missed pour. A missed pour becomes an idle crew. An idle crew becomes a schedule delay. And a schedule delay becomes a client wondering why they trusted you in the first place. I was good at finding problems before they grew teeth. By the time I was 34, I managed some of Westbridge's most demanding projects. I had completed a medical office complex worth $11 million. I had recovered a distribution center project after a steel supplier missed a delivery window. I had kept a high-end hotel renovation on schedule during a winter so cold that concrete crews could barely work 3 days a week. I was not the loudest person in meetings. I did not make dramatic speeches. I did not pretend every success was mine. I just knew the work. I knew when a subcontractor was making excuses. I knew when an architect was changing scope without admitting it. I knew when a client was nervous, even if they said they were just checking in. And I knew that the strongest relationships were not built at ribbon-cutting ceremonies. They were built at 6:30 in the morning when a client had a problem and you answered your phone. That was how I became the lead project manager for a client called Harper Health Systems. Harper was expanding fast. They owned outpatient clinics in 3 states and had plans to build a new surgical center outside Columbus. The contract was worth just over $4 million. For Westbridge, it was more than one project. It was a doorway. If we delivered that surgical center well, Harper planned to use us for 6 more facilities over the next 3 years. The potential pipeline was close to $30 million. I had worked with Harper's facilities director, Linda Carver, for nearly 4 years. Linda was practical. She did not care how polished your presentation was. She cared whether you showed up prepared. She cared whether you gave her honest answers. And she cared whether a contractor kept promises when the project became difficult. I had earned her trust during a clinic renovation 2 years earlier. A subcontractor had walked off the job after a payment dispute. The company wanted to bury the problem until Monday. I called Linda on Saturday morning. I told her exactly what happened. Then I gave her 3 options and a recovery schedule. She later told me that was the moment she decided she would keep working with me. Not because nothing went wrong, because I did not pretend nothing was wrong. Then came Evan Pike. Evan joined Westbridge as Chief Operating Officer after working for a national developer. He was 41, sharp, polished, and always dressed like someone was taking his photo. He had expensive glasses, expensive shoes, and a habit of placing his phone face up on the conference table, as if the entire company might need him at any moment. Evan loved efficiency. Or at least, he loved the word. He said it constantly. Efficiency is culture. Efficiency is accountability. Efficiency is respect. He used the word so often that people stopped asking what he actually meant. What Evan really meant was this: if a cost did not look important in a report, then the person requesting it must be wasting money. He had never run a project from the ground. He had never had a delivery truck break down on the way to a job site. He had never stood in a half-finished building at 5 a.m., trying to decide whether a delay would cost $5,000 or $50,000. But he had built beautiful dashboards. And he trusted dashboards more than people. In his first 6 months, Evan cut the discretionary project budget. He centralized expense approvals. He required every project manager to submit receipts within 48 hours. He announced that small financial discipline prevents large financial failure. That sounded reasonable, until you saw how he applied it. A project manager who bought emergency tarps during a storm was questioned for exceeding the supply limit. A superintendent who paid for a last-minute site cleaning crew had to write a 2-page justification. A coordinator who bought coffee and sandwiches for workers during an overnight inspection was told she had blurred the line between morale and misuse. Every dollar became a test of loyalty. Not to the company, to Evan. Then, 3 weeks before the Harper Surgical Center contract was scheduled to be signed, I had a problem. A critical meeting had been moved from Thursday to Monday. The Harper executive team was flying in from Cleveland. Linda was bringing their CFO, their clinical operations director, and 2 board representatives. They wanted to review the final schedule, contingency plan, and pricing assumptions before signing. This was the meeting. The one that would decide whether Westbridge got the $4 million project. The meeting was scheduled for 8 a.m. at the project site. That meant my superintendent, our mechanical subcontractor, and I needed to be there by 6:30. The problem was a major storm had hit the area that weekend. 2 access roads were closed. The normal catering vendor could not deliver. The nearest open place was a diner 12 minutes from the site. At 6:42 a.m., I bought breakfast and coffee for the 6 people preparing the final presentation. 6 breakfasts, 6 coffees, 1 box of pastries for the Harper team. The total was $198.74. I kept the receipt. I submitted it that afternoon. I categorized it as client meeting preparation. I added the note, critical Harper Health Systems signing meeting. Site access delayed by storm. Team on site before 7 a.m. I thought nothing of it. Then, 4 days later, Evan called me into his office. He had printed the receipt. Printed it. He placed it directly in the center of his desk. Then he looked at me over his glasses and said, "Do you believe this is an appropriate use of company funds?" I thought he was joking. He was not. I explained the situation. The storm. The early start. The signing meeting. The 6 people working before the client arrived. Evan listened without taking notes. Then he said, "You spent nearly $200 on breakfast." I said, "I spent $198.74 on the team preparing for a $4 million contract." He leaned back. "That is not the point." I asked what the point was. He said, "The point is whether you believe rules apply to you." That was when I understood the meeting was not about breakfast. Evan had been looking for a reason to make an example out of someone. And he had chosen me. What Evan did not know was that Harper's signing meeting had not just been about price. 2 months earlier, Linda had asked me to add 1 condition to the proposed contract, something she said would prove whether Westbridge valued accountability more than appearances. Evan never read the final draft. In less than 2 weeks, that decision would cost him the deal he thought was already won. The meeting in Evan's office lasted 19 minutes. I remember that because the clock on his wall was directly behind him. At 2:11 p.m., he asked whether I had obtained prior approval for the expense. I said no. At 2:12 p.m., he asked whether I had considered using my own money. I said, "For a client meeting?" At 2:13 p.m., he said that senior employees should model judgment. At 2:15 p.m., he asked whether I had ever submitted another expense outside policy. I said, "Not that I know of." At 2:17 p.m., he opened a folder. Inside was a list of every expense I had submitted over the past year. Hotel parking, tolls, site supplies, meals during late-night work sessions. Nothing unusual. Nothing improper. But Evan had highlighted a $16.50 coffee meeting from 6 months earlier. He had highlighted a $42 parking charge from a client site. He had highlighted a $29 hardware store purchase for temporary safety signage. He was not investigating fraud. He was building a story. A story where I was careless with money. A story where he was the executive brave enough to enforce standards. I told him every expense had been approved. He said approval did not mean it was correct. I told him the Harper breakfast had helped us prepare for the largest pending contract in the company. He smiled slightly. Not warmly. Not even confidently. Just enough to show me he thought he had control. "Margaret," he said, "you are confusing results with permission." That was Evan's version of wisdom. Results with permission. As if getting a deal done was somehow separate from the work required to get it done. The next morning, I was called into another meeting. This time, human resources was there. So was Evan. And so was the company president, Charles Weller. Charles had founded Westbridge with his brother 22 years earlier. He used to visit job sites in work boots. Now he spent most days at industry events, investor lunches, and meetings with banks. He still seemed like a decent man. But he had reached the stage many founders reach when their company grows. He trusted the people around him to tell him what was happening. And Evan had become very good at telling stories. The HR director slid a document across the table. It said I was being terminated for repeated violations of company expense controls and failure to demonstrate sound financial judgment. Repeated violations. For $198.74. I looked at Charles. He looked uncomfortable. But he did not stop it. Evan said the decision was final. Then he told me to turn in my laptop, my project phone, and my site access badge. I asked one question. "Who is taking over Harper Health Systems?" Evan answered immediately. "I am." I nodded. Then I asked, "Have you reviewed the final contract terms?" He said, "I have reviewed what matters." That answer stayed with me. Because Evan had no idea what mattered. I signed nothing that day except the acknowledgement that I had received the termination notice. I did not argue. I did not mention the $4 million contract. I did not warn them what might happen. I handed over my equipment, collected my personal things, and left Westbridge at 10:36 a.m. By 11:20 a.m., I was sitting in my car in a grocery store parking lot, staring at my hands on the steering wheel. I was not angry yet. I was trying to understand the calculation. 6 years of project delivery. Hundreds of subcontractor problems resolved. Millions of dollars in completed work. A client relationship that could change the company's future. And they had decided that a breakfast receipt made me a risk. Then I remembered something important. Evan had never asked whether I had attended the Harper signing meeting. He had never asked whether the client had noticed the preparation. He had never asked why Linda had personally called me afterward to say the meeting was the most organized project review she had seen all year. He only saw $198.74. That was his first mistake. Not firing me. Not even accusing me. His first mistake was looking at a number without understanding what it bought. The day after I was fired, I received a call from Linda Carver. I did not answer. I had already reviewed my termination paperwork with an attorney. The agreement included standard confidentiality language and a reminder that I could not solicit Westbridge clients. Fine. I had no intention of doing that. But the attorney gave me advice that I was grateful for. Do not guess. Do not react. Do not say more than you need to say. So when Linda called a second time, I sent a short text. I am no longer with Westbridge. For project matters, please contact Charles Weller or Evan Pike. She replied almost immediately. Are you okay? I stared at the message. Then I wrote, I appreciate you asking. I cannot discuss internal matters. That was all. At 3:18 p.m., Charles emailed Linda and the Harper team. He announced that Evan would be assuming direct leadership of the project. The email described my departure as a personnel matter unrelated to Westbridge's commitment to excellence. It also said the contract was still on track for signature the following Friday. Evan apparently believed that if he sounded certain enough, the client would not ask questions. But Linda did ask questions. First, she asked whether I had been removed from the project voluntarily. Charles said he could not discuss personnel issues. Then she asked whether the project budget, schedule, or risk assessments I had developed were still valid. Evan replied that Westbridge was conducting a leadership review of all materials. That was the exact wrong answer. because Harper had already spent weeks reviewing those materials with me. The CFO had based financing assumptions on them. The clinical operations director had planned equipment delivery around them. The board representatives had approved the project because the schedule included specific contingency protections. By saying he was reviewing everything, Evan had told the client that the plan might not be as stable as they thought. At 5:44 p.m., Linda sent a message to Charles. She requested an emergency call for Monday morning. She copied Harper's legal counsel. That was when Westbridge started to understand there was a problem. On Monday at 8 a.m., Evan joined the call with Charles, Harper's executive team, and 2 people from Westbridge Legal. I was not there. I did not need to be. The story reached me later through a former superintendent, and later through documents my attorney received after Westbridge contacted me. Linda started calmly. She said Harper had selected Westbridge in part because of my project leadership. Evan said Westbridge had deep operational depth and that the project would be stronger with executive oversight. Linda asked whether the risk register I had prepared was still the official project plan. Evan said they were optimizing it. She asked what that meant. He said the team was reviewing opportunities to improve cost efficiency. The CFO asked whether those changes would affect the construction contingency. Evan said, potentially. That one word changed the meeting. Potentially. The room apparently went quiet. Because the contingency was not a luxury. It was the part of the budget that protected Harper if specialized medical equipment installation ran late or if supply delays affected the surgical wing. Without it, a small delay could cost the client hundreds of thousands of dollars. Linda asked why the contingency was being reviewed. Evan said he believed there was room to modernize the approach. That was his favorite move. Take something he did not understand. Call it outdated. Then propose changing it. At 9:12 a.m., Harper's legal counsel asked for a copy of the finalized contract before any further discussion. Evan said he would send it. Then he discovered the problem. The final contract had not been signed, and the draft contained the condition Linda had requested 2 months earlier. A key person accountability clause. The clause gave Harper the right to pause contract execution if Westbridge removed the named project leader before construction began, unless Harper approved the replacement. The named project leader was me, not Westbridge, not Evan. Me. Evan had fired me before the contract was signed. Now Harper had a right to stop the deal, request a replacement review, or walk away entirely. That was the first time Charles called me. At 10:34 a.m., his name appeared on my phone. I let it ring once. Twice. Then I answered. He started with my name. Margaret. I said, Charles. He sounded exhausted. We have a situation with Harper. I assumed you might. He did not like that answer. But again, he could not argue with it. He said the client was asking questions about the transition. I said they should. He said Evan is working through it. I said, then Evan should be able to answer them. There was a pause. Then Charles said, we may need your help. That was the first satisfying turn. Not because I wanted Charles worried. Because the company had finally recognized what Evan's $200 investigation had missed. I was not a receipt. I was the person who had built the trust behind the deal. If you have ever been judged by a tiny mistake while someone ignores everything you have delivered, subscribe, because this was where a $200 accusation began turning into a $4 million lesson. Charles asked whether I would speak with Harper. I told him I would only consider it under a formal consulting agreement. He said the company did not have time for negotiations. I said the company had time to investigate a breakfast receipt for 4 days. It can make time to prepare a contract. He went quiet. Then he said legal would contact me. The offer arrived that afternoon. It was exactly what I expected. A short-term consulting agreement. My old daily rate. No minimum guarantee. No defined authority. No protection if Evan overruled decisions and blamed me afterward. They wanted me to return, convince Harper to sign, and then disappear. I declined. I sent a revised proposal. 30 days. Payment in advance. A clear scope covering only Harper's project transition. Authority to present the original risk register and schedule directly to the client. And one condition Evan hated when he read it. Any changes to budget contingency, schedule protection, or subcontractor selection would require written approval from Harper and Charles. Evan called me at 6:21 p.m. His voice was sharper than Charles's. "Do you honestly believe you are in a position to dictate terms?" I said, "I believe I am in a position to protect myself from doing work without authority. You are holding the company hostage over a $200 expense." I stayed quiet for a moment. Then I said, "No, Evan. You fired me over a $200 expense. The company is now dealing with the consequences of who you chose to fire." He said I was being opportunistic. I said, "I am being careful." He said he could handle Harper without me. I said, "Then you should." And I ended the call. The next morning, Harper sent Westbridge a formal letter. They were invoking the key person accountability clause. They would not sign the contract until they met the proposed replacement and received written assurance that the project plan would not be materially altered. They also requested the complete record of communications regarding my removal. Westbridge Legal had a problem. They could not provide a clean explanation. The company's internal file said I was terminated for repeated expense violations. But the attached documentation showed one primary expense: breakfast. $198.74. The client did not need to know every detail to understand the basic picture. Westbridge had removed the project manager they trusted less than 2 weeks before contract signing, apparently over a minor expense dispute. That did not look like financial discipline. It looked unstable. By Thursday, Charles accepted every major term in my proposal. At 4:50 p.m., I signed. At 5:03 p.m., I was officially retained as an independent consultant. Not an employee. Not Evan's subordinate. Not someone who needed his approval to tell the client the truth about the project plan. The first thing I did was request a copy of the updated Harper materials. What I saw made my stomach tighten. Evan had removed $310,000 from the contingency reserve. He had reduced the schedule by 12 days. He had replaced a mechanical subcontractor I had vetted for 9 months with a lower bidder who had never worked in an active surgical environment. And he had presented those changes as efficiency opportunities. That was the point of no return. Because I knew Harper would not simply question whether Westbridge was ready. They would question whether Westbridge could be trusted anywhere near a medical project. The final Harper meeting took place the following Tuesday at 7:30 a.m. The time mattered. Linda scheduled it early because she wanted to walk the site before the meeting began. The surgical center was still an empty shell of steel and concrete. But to Harper, it was not empty. It was future operating rooms, future patient schedules, future staff hires, future revenue. Every decision on that site had consequences beyond the drawings. Linda arrived with the CFO, the clinical operations director, and legal counsel. Charles arrived with Evan, Westbridge's general counsel, and me. I was introduced as an independent consultant assisting with the transition. Evan tried to begin the meeting. Linda stopped him. She said she wanted to hear from me first. Not because she was taking sides. Because she wanted facts. I walked them through the original project plan. The schedule. The subcontractor selection. The contingency reserve. The equipment delivery coordination. The weather and supply chain risks. I explained why each protection existed. Then Linda asked whether the plan had changed after I left. I did not speculate. I placed the revised documents on the table. The CFO looked at the contingency reduction first. Then he looked at Evan. Why was this removed? Evan said the original contingency was overly conservative. I said nothing. The clinical operations director looked at the revised schedule. Why was the commissioning period reduced? Evan said the team believed it could be managed more efficiently. Again, I said nothing. Then the legal counsel looked at the subcontractor change. Has this replacement contractor completed a surgical environment installation? Evan said they had extensive commercial experience. That was not my question, she said. He paused. Then said, not specifically. The room went quiet. It was not a dramatic silence. Nobody slammed a folder shut. Nobody raised their voice. It was worse than that. It was the silence of people realizing that the executive in charge had been making decisions without understanding what they affected. Linda looked at Charles. Was Margaret terminated because he objected to these changes? Charles said no. He said it was related to an expense policy matter. Linda asked what kind of expense matter. Charles hesitated. Evan answered for him. An unauthorized client-related purchase. Linda asked the amount. Evan did not answer. She asked again. How much? Charles said, just under $200. The CFO blinked. Then he looked at the table full of revised documents. $310,000 removed from contingency. 12 days removed from the schedule. A subcontractor replaced without relevant experience. And the person who objected had been fired over breakfast. The CFO said, "You terminated the project manager we trusted over $200, then made changes that expose us to millions?" Evan started to explain. He said the expense had represented a pattern of judgment issues. I finally spoke. My voice was calm. Every expense I submitted was approved. The breakfast was purchased during an early morning signing meeting after a storm closed access routes. The receipt included a written explanation. Evan looked at me. I continued. The project team was on site before 7 a.m. to prepare for Harper's executive review. The expense total was $198.74. Linda did not look at Evan. She looked at Charles. Then she said, "This is not how a stable contractor behaves." Charles had no response. The meeting moved slowly after that. Harper's legal counsel reviewed the key person clause. She said Harper had every right to pause the process. The CFO said the company would not approve a project with reduced contingency and an unqualified mechanical contractor. Linda said trust had been damaged. Then she asked a question nobody from Westbridge wanted to hear. "Can you guarantee that Margaret will lead this project if we continue?" Charles looked at Evan. Evan looked at the floor. I answered before either of them could. "I cannot make that guarantee. I am not an employee of Westbridge." Linda nodded. She already knew. That was the thing Evan never understood. Clients do not just buy a company's name. They buy confidence that the people making decisions understand the work. And when that confidence disappears, a logo cannot replace it. Harper ended the meeting by giving Westbridge 48 hours to provide a final answer. Restore the original risk protections. Replace the mechanical contractor. Provide a written explanation of leadership accountability. And confirm who would manage the project. Charles wanted me to return as project manager. He offered my job back that afternoon. A higher salary. A retention bonus. A title change. He said Evan would no longer be involved in Harper. I thanked him. Then I asked the question that mattered. Will I have final authority to protect the project when the next executive decides a risk looks inefficient? Charles could not answer immediately. And that was my answer. I did not return. I completed my consulting scope. I documented the original plan. I helped Harper understand the project risks. And I made sure every statement I gave was factual, professional, and within my agreement. Then Harper made its decision. At 9:06 a.m. on Wednesday, Charles called me. His voice was flat. He said Harper had awarded the contract to another construction company, a firm that had offered a slightly higher price, but agreed to retain the original contingency structure and bring in a medical project specialist. The $4 million contract was gone. So was the future pipeline. Harper did not want Westbridge bidding on the next 6 facilities. They did not cancel because I told them to. I never did. They canceled because Westbridge showed them exactly how it treated judgment, preparation, and accountability. Charles asked me what he should say to the board. I said, "Tell them the truth." He asked what that was. I said, "You treated a $200 receipt like a crisis and ignored the decisions that actually put the company at risk." He did not argue. Evan was placed on leave 2 days later. A month after that, he resigned. The company described it as a leadership transition. Of course they did. Companies use soft language when hard mistakes become too expensive to hide. But everyone at Westbridge knew what happened. Evan had wanted to prove that no employee was bigger than the company. Instead, he proved that a company can become smaller the moment it stops respecting the people who do the work. As for me, I did not go looking for revenge. I went looking for a better place to work. 3 months later, I joined a construction firm that specialized in healthcare projects. They had seen the Harper situation from a distance. They liked my track record. They liked that I had stayed professional. And they liked that I understood the difference between cutting costs and cutting the things that protect a project. My first assignment was a $9 million outpatient facility. The first line in my project budget was a contingency reserve. The second was a client meeting expense allowance. It was not huge, just enough to make sure the people doing the work could get through early mornings without having to ask whether coffee was worth a disciplinary hearing. The lesson is not that policies do not matter. They do. Expense rules matter. Budgets matter. Accountability matters. But a policy is supposed to protect the business, not become a weapon for someone trying to prove authority. If you work in a role where your judgment creates value, document your decisions. Keep your receipts. Explain the business reason behind unusual expenses. Send important warnings in writing. And when someone questions your work, ask for specifics. Not emotion. Not assumptions. Specifics. What policy did I violate? What information was overlooked? What outcome are we trying to prevent? Those questions force people to move from accusation to evidence. And if your employer ends your role, know your rights. Read what you sign. Understand your obligations. Do not perform unpaid work because the people who dismissed you suddenly discover they need you. Urgency is not a contract. Guilt is not a contract. And being professional does not mean accepting responsibility without authority. Being untouchable does not mean nobody can fire you. Anyone can make that decision. Being untouchable means your work is documented, your reputation is earned, and your skills remain valuable even after someone tries to reduce your contribution to one tiny number on a receipt. The next story begins when HR looked a long-time employee in the eye and said, "It's just business," after eliminating her role 2 weeks before her bonus was due. She did not argue. She did not make a scene. She opened the company policy they thought nobody had read, found one clause buried on page 47, and made their business decision very expensive. Subscribe, because when HR tells her it is not personal, she decides to make it her business.